Putin made a huge mistake. The Russian leader was certain that he had completely captured Europe's political will within his own orbit through the secret network of influence he had been weaving thread by thread for years. This system, which stretched across the continent and was sustained by shadowy manipulations, was Moscow's flawlessly functioning strategic masterpiece. But today, that supposedly unshakable machine of influence is crashing down with a loud bang. This is no ordinary diplomatic tremor. It is an unprecedented geopolitical earthquake, advancing like an unstoppable domino on the map and uprooting the Kremlin's influence from its very roots. It all began with a small spark of rebellion igniting in the historic streets of Prague. Moscow dismissed this spark, but the fire spread rapidly southward to the wide boulevards of Budapest. From there, it transformed into a massive flood of rage that swept through the freezing squares of Bratislava. This unstoppable wave of awakening reached as far as the icy shores of the Baltics, so much so that even in Narva, a city on Estonia's border with Russia, there is today a single, clear voice of rebellion mingling with the cold winds. Hundreds of thousands of people have united like never before in history to tear down that suffocating shadow that has mortgaged their futures. In particular, the massive crowds filling the streets of the Czech Republic have finally turned the Kremlin's greatest nightmare into reality. Because this massive uprising does more than just force local governments to back down. It holds the potential to deliver a fatal blow to the dark network that directly fuels Russia's occupation machinery in Ukraine. Putin's destructive war in Ukraine was the final straw that broke the patience of the people in neighboring countries. The move to deploy troops under the pretext of protecting Russian minorities abroad further fueled this anger. No one wants to remain silent in the face of the Kremlin's imperial games and political blackmail anymore. From this point onward, the Czech Republic became the most effective catalyst for igniting massive popular protests, as we have mentioned. This country has virtually become the symbol of this massive uprising and the resistance shaking Europe. Because the streets of Prague became the stage for one of history's largest and most critical tests of democracy. This massive protest, expected to draw 400,000 participants, went down in history as the heaviest blow to Russia's influence in Europe. Yes, you heard that right. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Letná Park. In that historic square where communism was overthrown in 1989, Czech citizens once again chanted slogans for freedom. Independent sources have definitively confirmed that there were at least 200,000 to 250,000 angry and determined citizens in the area. However, the figure of 400,000 put forward by the organizers clearly demonstrates the massive potential for uprising within the Czech people. The size of the crowds ready to take to the streets was truly of an indisputable magnitude. Because this unique and magnificent crowd represented the largest anti-government and anti-Russia popular uprising seen in the Czech Republic since 2019. These protests are perhaps the most concrete indication that the dynamics in Europe are no longer the same for Putin. At the same time, this uprising is being recorded as the clearest stance taken by Czech citizens in recent times. Because these people did not merely challenge their own government, they also directly rebelled against Moscow's dark mindset and the export of its despotic regime. A single slogan from the people's mouths spread like a seismic wave from Letná Park across all of Europe. We will not allow our future to be stolen. The Babiš government structure, which relies on oligarchs, and its drift away from democracy, had been the dangerous final straw that broke the camel's back. In particular, that infamous Foreign Agents Law, which targeted civil society organizations, independent journalists, and activists, brought public anger to a boiling point. The Czech people knew this repressive law was a direct copy of a Russian model. They were acutely aware that the Kremlin's tactics had been adapted for Prague. The attempt to implement Putin's strategy of silencing opponents and stifling civil society right in the heart of Europe was enough to bring hundreds of thousands into the streets. On the other hand, this outburst in the Czech Republic was no ordinary domestic political crisis, because this Central European country, shaken by protests, is one of Ukraine's most loyal, bravest, and militarily most resolute supporters in Europe. Since the start of the war, they have provided over $800 million in massive direct military aid to Ukraine. Through the Czech Ammunition Initiative, they have established Europe's largest artillery shell supply network. This has provided significant support to keep Ukraine's artillery operational. Having delivered 1.8 million artillery shells to the front lines in 2025 alone, the Czech Republic has already secured funding for hundreds of thousands of shells for 2026. This is precisely why this popular uprising in the Czech Republic represents the realization of Putin's worst nightmares on the streets of Prague. Moscow had hoped to create political chaos in Prague to block the supply of ammunition trains and military equipment heading to Ukraine. The goal was to sever the country from the Western Axis through the Babiš government. Plans were in place to paralyze the opposition using the Foreign Agents Act. However, the hundreds of thousands of people filling Letná Park shattered Putin's insidious hybrid hopes in the Czech Republic. The Czech people are acutely aware that Ukraine's resistance is, in fact, a guarantee of their own freedom. They shouted to the world that they would never stand idly by while their country veered onto the dark, pro-Russian path taken by Hungary or Slovakia. This massive protest is, above all, a very clear ultimatum to the Babiš government. If the government attempts to make concessions to Russia and slow down aid to Ukraine, the next step for those 400,000 people could be to overthrow the government. While Putin aims to sever one of Kiev's logistical lifelines by undermining the Czech Republic from within, he has found a people more enraged than ever before. As is evident, the stance against Putin and his collaborators in the country has irreversibly reached its most negative level. This massive crowd is the proof of failure for the Kremlin's political engineering projects in Central Europe. However, the mass European protest waves that have deeply wounded Putin are not limited to the Czech Republic, because this historic resistance in Prague has transcended borders to become a massive source of inspiration for the entire region. This torch of democracy has given courage above all to the people living in the shadow of repressive regimes just to the south. We now turn our eyes to the front, where this wave has struck hardest, Europe's most critical and contentious front, Hungary. In Budapest, the political waters are flowing more heatedly, dangerously, and unpredictably than ever before. Ahead of the historic parliamentary elections in April, Viktor Orbán's once untouchable stronghold is being shaken to its foundations. The pro-Russian policy that Orbán's government has stubbornly pursued for years is now being vehemently rejected by his own people. The Hungarian people feel deep shame and discomfort at their country acting like a Russian satellite right in the heart of the European Union. This social unrest erupted into an unprecedented outburst of anger on the national holiday of March 15th. Tens of thousands of Hungarian citizens took to the streets to free their country's honor from Moscow's grip. The rising star of the opposition, Péter Magyar, delivered a very harsh and historic speech that day, giving voice to the feelings of millions. Péter Magyar shattered taboos by openly labeling Orbán, the country's 16-year-long prime minister, a traitor. Magyar went even further, accusing Orbán of inviting Russian agents into the country to manipulate the upcoming April elections. The words, "Orbán sold Hungarian freedom for 30 pieces of silver," were the most shocking truth echoing through the streets of Budapest and shaking the Kremlin. Viktor Orbán, the Kremlin's biggest Trojan horse within the European Union, is facing the greatest existential crisis of his political career. That arrogant stance, which bought Putin time by blocking aid to Ukraine, is now crashing against the very wall built by Hungarian voters themselves. Independent international polls claim that the opposition TISA party has left Fidesz, the long unbeatable force, far behind by a significant margin. As Orbán panics, he is trying to scare voters by building his election campaign around an interesting and imaginary threat from Kyiv. Viktor Orbán even used a threatening video from a former Ukrainian official as an excuse. He even staged a phone call in front of cameras, pretending to contact family members to portray himself as a victim. However, such political maneuvers can no longer erase the image of him as a Russian puppet in the eyes of the Hungarian people. These massive anti-Russian protests, which peaked in March 2026, are the clearest and most brutal proof of Putin's loss of power in the Balkans and Central Europe. Moscow is forced to watch as its most trusted ally flounders helplessly against its own people in its own backyard. The possibility of Orbán losing the upcoming elections is literally causing a chill in the Kremlin corridors. If Budapest falls, Russia's famous veto shield within the European Union could vanish forever. This situation may signal the loss of one of the most critical levers in Vladimir Putin's plan to bring Europe under his control. At the same time, the possibility of Putin losing this power works in Kyiv's favor. Because if the ties between Budapest and Moscow are severed, the final major barrier blocking billions of euros in aid destined for Ukraine will also be breached. Putin's widespread political collapse in Europe is advancing unabated, fueled by the region's popular uprisings and protests. This situation is creating a domino effect, impacting neighboring Slovakia as well. With Robert Fico's rise to power, Slovakia was rapidly and dangerously being steered toward the Russian axis. Fico, just like his political twin Orbán, had turned his back on Ukraine and begun building shadowy bridges with Moscow. However, the Slovak people recognized this dangerous game of Russian roulette being played with their country's future very early on. The streets of Bratislava have become the epicenter of an uninterrupted democratic resistance since 2024. Slovak citizens categorically and vehemently reject Putin's authority to decide the direction of their country and the future of their children. In January, tens of thousands of people filled the squares, chanting, "Fico has surrendered to Russia," despite the freezing cold. In March, massive simultaneous marches were held in 41 different cities against the Russian model aimed at stifling civil society. From Putin's perspective, the situation in Slovakia was moving toward irreversible proportions with each passing day. Russia's toxic and insidious hybrid influence over Slovakia was eroding day by day thanks to the people's relentless resistance. The Slovaks proved in the streets that they would never stand idly by while their country turned into a dark Russian province. The Fico government's hostile decisions against Ukraine and its energy blackmail are met with profound shame even by its own voters. The loss of this social legitimacy in Slovakia is fundamentally shaking the balance of power in Central Europe and the Balkans. The lifespan of pro-Russian governments, which lack popular support and survive only through political blackmail and a climate of fear, is steadily shrinking. In other words, while Putin hoped to divide and fragment Europe, he has instead united the region's peoples around an anti-Russian axis. However, the erosion of the Kremlin's connections is not limited to these developments. For this massive loss of influence and power extends far beyond the triangle of the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia. Let us turn our gaze a bit further south. When we look into Serbia, considered Russia's historical and emotional backyard, and the depths of the Balkans, the picture remains unchanged. In Serbia, President Vučić is still walking a dangerous tightrope, oscillating between Russia and the West. However, the Serbian people have also begun to question how Moscow's dark agenda is jeopardizing their own European integration. U.S. intelligence reports clearly reveal that Russia feeds off chaos in the Western Balkans rather than building peace. The dangerous separatist games being played in Bosnia and Herzegovina through Milorad Dodik no longer instill fear in the region's people, but rather disgust. Countries like Montenegro and North Macedonia, however, have long since turned their faces toward Europe. They have raised their defensive shields against Russian hybrid threats. In the Balkans, there is no trace left of Moscow's former legendary power or its role as a cultural hub. What stands before us is the wreckage of a Russian diplomacy that has become ineffective, increasingly isolated, and clinging to survival through nothing but cheap manipulation. As we move rapidly northward from the Balkans toward the Baltic region, we see much more clearly just how dangerous Putin's desperation has become. That scandalous bill under discussion in the Russian State Duma has sounded an alarm bell akin to a pre-war warning in the Baltic states. This bill, which permits the use of the military under the guise of protecting Russian minorities abroad, is seen as an open admission of the Kremlin's intentions to invade. The hottest and most vulnerable point of this hybrid threat is undoubtedly the Estonian border city of Narva. This city, where 97% of the population speaks Russian, is intended to be transformed into a new hybrid war laboratory where Putin will test Europe. The fake separatist propaganda circulating online under the name Narva People's Republic immediately caught the attention of Estonian intelligence. But Estonia did not bow to these cheap tricks. On the contrary, by erecting physical concrete defense lines along its borders, they clearly defied Moscow. So while Putin sought to create fear and panic in the Baltics, he was forced to face NATO's most resilient, best prepared, and most vigilant shield. Meanwhile, alongside Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are also on high alert. They are immediately scrutinizing the suspicious activities of Russian citizens and their intelligence networks. Latvia's uncompromising decisions to expel individuals are the clearest proof that the region will no longer bow to Moscow's blackmail. Poland, meanwhile, stands firm as one of the most steadfast and powerful strongholds of this massive anti-Russian resistance front. On February 25, 2026, the fourth anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, Warsaw's historic Royal Castle Square was the scene of a massive gathering. Tens of thousands of Poles and Ukrainians shattered Moscow's entire disinformation network with the slogan, "Putin always lies!" This vast geography, stretching from northern to southern Europe, from the Baltics to the Balkans, is now shouting a single truth in a united voice. Putin's dark empire of lies, built on fear, is crumbling like a house of cards in the face of the just anger of the awakening people. In short, the current situation in the Balkans, Europe, and the Baltics looks bleak and tragic from Russia's perspective. That historic awakening in the Czech Republic was the most unique tableau symbolizing the spirit, the fire, and the breaking point of this entire massive awakening process. That massive roar echoing through Letná Park actually heralded the political funeral of Moscow in Europe. The immense courage displayed by hundreds of thousands of Czech citizens instilled morale in the streets of Slovakia and a belief in victory in the squares of Hungary. This great chain of uprisings is etching into history in golden letters how the dark schemes of dictators, hatched behind closed doors, can be shattered by peoples thirsting for freedom. Moscow's once intimidating, invincible, and pervasive image may already be completely shattered on the streets of Europe. The Kremlin has now completely lost control just beyond its own borders. Its agents of influence have been exposed. They have turned into a structure floundering in panic. The Balkans, Central Europe, and the Baltics are ushering in a brand new era. They are building a free Europe where, in the future, it will not be Putin, but their own free will that holds sway. This voice rising today from Prague to Budapest, from Bratislava to Warsaw, proves that the course of history has now changed. The walls Russia built through pressure and manipulation are being torn down by the people themselves. Europe's heart now beats not with fear, but with freedom and solidarity. No tyrant will be able to stand in the way of this awakening. What are your thoughts on this massive uprising and the collapse of Russia's influence in Europe? Is this spark igniting in Prague signaling the end of Putin? Or could the Kremlin make a comeback with a new and even more dangerous move? In your opinion, which countries will this domino effect engulf? Don't forget to share your views and analyses in the comments. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.